In the mid-1960s, the United States military apparatus in Southeast Asia faced a profound operational paradox. The Department of Defense had deployed an unprecedented industrial logistics network, moving millions of tons of ordnance, coordinating highly advanced aerospace platforms, and saturating the jungle canopy with complex sensor grids. Yet, against this overwhelming technocratic weight, the ideological conditioning and combat discipline of the opposing forces remained largely intact. Conventional kinetic strategies were failing to break the operational morale of the National Liberation Front and the North Vietnamese forces. Intelligence officers began to realize that if high explosive ordnance and standard strategic maneuvers could not erode the resolve of the opposing infantry, they needed to fundamentally change the nature of the pressure they were applying. They needed to find a structural flaw in the human mind itself. If you find this intersection of military engineering, psychological warfare, and declassified defense programs as fascinating as I do, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. We regularly explore the historical archives to break down how these deeply unconventional operations actually functioned on a technical and institutional level. To bypass the rigid military discipline of their adversaries, intelligence analysts attached to the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, initiated a sweeping review of cultural and anthropological data. By translating captured personal diaries and conducting extensive debriefings with defectors, these officers isolated a deeply rooted cultural vulnerability. It was a specific, regional interpretation of a Buddhist spiritual tradition regarding the afterlife. According to this long-held belief, a person who lived a full life and was properly laid to rest in their home village would find peace. However, if an individual was lost far from home and their remains were never recovered for proper ceremonial rites, their spirit would be denied transition. They would become a wandering soul. These restless spirits were believed to be trapped in a state of eternal localized agony, condemned to walk the earth in the exact location where they fell. They were entirely severed from their ancestors. For the soldiers operating in the deep, unfamiliar foliage of the Central Highlands or the dense swamps of the Mekong Delta, thousands of kilometers from their ancestral villages, this was not simply a passing superstition. It was a foundational, existential fear. An infantryman could accept the probability of not surviving an engagement, but the prospect of their spirit being permanently abandoned in the dark. Foreign canopy generated extreme psychological pressure. Consider the implications of this discovery for the intelligence officers sitting in their planning rooms. They had just identified a cultural phenomenon that bypassed all ideological training and political indoctrination. The human mind had an inherent vulnerability, and the military recognized an opportunity to exploit it. The Joint United States Public Affairs Office, working alongside psychological operations planners, began drafting a framework to weaponize this folklore. The proposed initiative was designated Operation Wandering Soul. The concept was as simple as it was entirely unprecedented. If the opposing forces feared the restless spirits of their fallen comrades, the United States military would simply manufacture those spirits and project them into the tactical environment. Planners theorized that if they could broadcast the simulated, tormented voices of lost soldiers calling out from the tree line, pleading with their former comrades to surrender, to go home, to avoid the same dark fate, they could trigger mass defections and paralyze entire units with unseen dread. This objective creates the core absurdity of the entire historical operation. You have the United States military, the most technologically advanced and heavily funded defense apparatus on the planet, mobilizing its vast resources to synthetically engineer an ancient ghost. Historically, psychological warfare relied on measurable, tangible products. Cargo aircraft dropped millions of printed leaflets detailing surrender procedures. Heavy broadcast aircraft played standard propaganda messages or conventional music over contested sectors. These methods were straightforward, utilizing standard radio frequencies and basic human communication. Operation Wandering Soul, however, represented an entirely different institutional mindset. The military was attempting to treat human superstition as a psychological variable that could be hacked through frequency modulation. They were attempting to merge deep, qualitative anthropological research with industrial-scale psychological warfare. The sheer audacity of the proposal meant it required approval from the highest levels of the command structure. Declassified records show that the planners presented their concept to the Pentagon, arguing that the operational cost of producing magnetic audio tape was negligible compared to the tactical value of neutralizing enemy formations without firing a single conventional weapon. The logic held. The defense establishment authorized the unprecedented Acoustic campaign, providing the funding and the logistical clearance to proceed. However, the moment the authorization was stamped, the fundamental nature of the problem shifted entirely. The cultural theory was sound, and the institutional backing was secured. But a severe logistical reality immediately set in. You cannot simply requisition the sound of a restless spirit through standard military supply chains. You cannot open a defense catalog and order a reel of supernatural dread. The intelligence officers had done their job. Now, the burden fell directly onto the shoulders of defense contractors, laboratory technicians, and audio engineers. These were professionals accustomed to measuring signal-to-noise ratios, calibrating aviation radar frequencies, and designing communication hardware. Suddenly, they were handed a highly classified mandate to construct an auditory hallucination from scratch. The requirement was heavily layered. The audio could not sound like a standard radio broadcast, or the opposing forces would immediately recognize it as a conventional psychological operation. The recordings had to sound profoundly unsettling, culturally authentic, and acoustically detached from any recognizable mechanical source. Furthermore, the audio track had to carry enough acoustic weight to be projected at massive volumes without losing its targeted psychological integrity. It is one thing to draft a memorandum suggesting the use of ghostly voices to disrupt an opposing infantry unit. It is an entirely different scientific endeavor to place an audio engineer inside a recording booth and demand they calculate the exact sonic frequency of a tormented soul. As the project moved from the theoretical desks of the Joint United States Public Affairs Office into the sound-proofed laboratories of military production studios, a bizarre new phase of the conflict began. The engineers had to figure out how to mathematically synthesize dread, piece by piece, layer by layer, onto a reel of magnetic tape. Deep within the secured facilities of the Joint United States Public Affairs Office, acoustic engineers transformed standard recording booths into laboratories of psychological manipulation. The environment was entirely clinical, a stark contrast to the grueling conditions of the tactical theater outside. Acoustic foam lined the walls to deaden any unwanted ambient noise. Heavy, multi-track magnetic tape recorders, likely massive analog machines common in high-end production studios of the late 1960s, dominated the control rooms. These technicians were highly trained professionals. They were accustomed to calibrating standard propaganda broadcasts, fine-tuning public service announcements, and maintaining the communication hardware that kept the military apparatus connected. Now, they were tasked with engineering an auditory artifact designed specifically to fracture the human mind. The master project was designated Ghost Tape Number 10. You cannot generate genuine human anguish entirely from synthetic oscillators. You need a baseline of organic human vocalization. To achieve this, American military engineers collaborated closely with South Vietnamese broadcasters and actors. This was not merely a matter of convenience. It was a critical operational security measure and an absolute cultural necessity. The cadence, the regional dialects, and the emotional inflection of the audio had to be flawless. Any linguistic anomaly or unnatural phrasing would immediately expose the broadcast as a fabricated psychological operation, rendering the entire million-dollar effort useless. Imagine the scene inside the soundproof booth. Voice actors were instructed to channel the darkest aspects of their own cultural folklore. They were asked to vocalize the profound sorrow of a soul forever severed from its ancestral home. Declassified production notes reveal the meticulous and highly uncomfortable nature of these recording sessions. The actors recorded pleas directed specifically at the opposing infantry. They called out to their hypothetical families, begging their former comrades to cease fighting, to return to their villages, and to avoid becoming wandering souls themselves. A female voice actor was brought in to play a weeping child, calling out into the void for her father. It was deeply unsettling work, but the raw vocal tracks were only the foundation. Once the dry vocals were captured on magnetic tape, the technicians went to work. This is exactly where the operation transitioned from a theatrical performance into a mathematically calculated acoustic weapon. In the analog era of the 1960s, manipulating sound required intense physical labor and precise mechanical intervention. Engineers stood over cutting blocks, physically slicing lengths of quarter-inch magnetic tape with razor blades. They layered multiple vocal tracks over one another to create a disorienting, chorus-like effect. One voice would speak in the foreground, sharp and clear, while 2 or 3 other voices murmured at a slightly offset tempo in the background. This technique deliberately fractured the listener's focus. The brain attempts to latch onto a single voice, but the layered audio continuously pulls attention in multiple directions, creating a subtle, creeping sense of paranoia. Consider the frequency manipulation required to maximize this effect. Audio technicians understand that the human ear is highly sensitive to specific frequency ranges, particularly those between 2,000 and 5,000 hertz. This is an evolutionary trait. It is the exact frequency range where human cries, screams, and distress signals naturally fall. By using heavy analog equalizers, the engineers artificially boosted these specific frequencies in the vocal tracks. They made the voices pierce. They tuned the audio to be sharp, grating, and impossible for the human auditory system to passively ignore. To successfully sell the illusion of the supernatural, the audio needed environmental context. Standard jungle background noise was insufficient. The engineers needed the environment itself to sound corrupted. They introduced the rhythmic, hollow tones of traditional Buddhist funeral gongs. But they did not simply record a gong and play it back at standard speed. Instead, they manipulated the playback mechanics. By slowing the tape speed down, they dropped the pitch and artificially stretched the decay of the sound. This acoustic technique transformed a familiar cultural artifact into a heavy, ominous drone that reverberated far longer than physical reality should allow. Over this foundation, they layered synthesized wind noises. Using early analog oscillators, technicians generated white noise and slowly swept the filter frequencies up and down. It successfully mimicked the sound of wind howling through a desolate valley, but the mathematical perfection of the synthetic wave gave it a distinctly unnatural, eerie quality. It sounded like wind blowing through an empty, metallic void. The final, crucial element was spatial processing. If you listen to a person speaking in a dense jungle environment, the sound is inherently muffled. The thick foliage, the heavy tree trunks, and the suffocating humidity absorb high frequencies almost immediately. The military engineers understood this physical reality. To make the voices sound as if they were ethereal, as if they were completely detached from the physical environment of the listener, they applied extreme reverberation and tape delay. By feeding the audio signal back into the recording machine at a fraction of a second delay, they created a cascading, endless echo. The weeping voices seemed to bounce off invisible canyon walls. The phantom soldiers sounded as though they were speaking from inside a massive, cavernous space, completely at odds with the tight, claustrophobic environment of a tropical rainforest. This dissonance was highly intentional. The engineers were treating human superstition as a psychological variable that could be hacked through frequency modulation. By presenting the brain with an acoustic signature that fundamentally contradicted the visual environment, they aimed to induce severe cognitive dissonance. The listener's ears would tell them they were standing in a massive, echoing cavern, while their eyes confirmed they were surrounded by dense, damp foliage. This sensory mismatch is a known trigger for extreme psychological unease. After weeks of continuous iteration, splicing, and equalizing, Ghost Tape number 10 was finalized. At precisely 3 minutes and 20 seconds long, it was a masterpiece of analog audio engineering. It began with the slowed, distorted funeral gongs, followed closely by the sweeping synthetic wind. Then, the phantom voices emerged from the heavy echo, weeping, warning, and pleading in an endless, looping cycle of engineered despair. The master reel was heavily guarded. From this single, heavily processed original source, laboratory technicians began the tedious process of duplication. The master audio was copied onto hundreds of standard portable magnetic tape reels. These duplicates were then meticulously cataloged, packaged into protective canisters, and shipped through the military logistics network to aviation units and psychological operations teams stationed across the theater of operations. The laboratory phase of the operation was officially complete. The defense contractors and military technicians had successfully manufactured the exact frequency of a restless spirit. The acoustic weapon was built, packaged, and ready for deployment. But within the pristine, climate-controlled walls of the recording studios, a massive operational unknown loomed over the entire project. Engineering an unsettling tape in a laboratory is an entirely different discipline than projecting that tape in a live combat theater. The engineers had perfectly calibrated the equalizers. They had optimized the signal-to-noise ratio. They had mathematically maximized the acoustic dread on the magnetic tape. But magnetic tape does not project itself. The operation now required moving these fragile, carefully crafted laboratory frequencies into one of the most hostile acoustic environments on the planet. The dense, heavily layered triple canopy jungle of Southeast Asia acts as a massive natural sound baffle. Millions of leaves, thick vegetation, and saturating humidity swallow sound waves, stripping away the exact high frequencies the engineers had so carefully boosted. If this operation was going to work, they could not rely on standard infantry loudspeakers. They needed a deployment mechanism capable of entirely overwhelming the dampening effect of the jungle. They needed brute, undeniable acoustic force. And to project that force effectively over wide swaths of contested territory, they needed to mount massively heavy, highly magnetic speaker arrays onto complex aviation platforms, flying dangerously low and slow, right above the heads of a heavily armed opposition in the dead of night. To bypass the sheer acoustic dampening of the dense jungle canopy, aviation engineers turned to two primary workhorses of the military logistics and airmobile fleets, the UH-1 Huey helicopter and the fixed-wing C-47 Skytrain. The objective was no longer a matter of audio engineering, it was a matter of raw, brute force physics, to project the carefully synthesized laboratory frequencies down through hundreds of feet of humid air and thick foliage. The military needed to deploy localized sound at staggering industrial volumes. The standard infantry loudspeakers, typically used for localized translation or basic crowd control, were entirely insufficient for this task. They lacked the wattage and the acoustic density required to push sound waves through a multi-layered canopy. Instead, aviation mechanics began requisitioning massive, heavy-duty public address arrays. These were not delicate instruments. They were massive clusters of metallic, weather-resistant cones capable of outputting well over 1,000 watts of continuous acoustic power. Consider the physical reality of what these aviation mechanics were trying to achieve. The inverse square law of acoustics dictates that sound intensity drops exponentially as it travels over a distance. To deliver a clear, unsettling whisper into the ear of a soldier hidden in the underbrush, the speaker bolted to an aircraft hovering 500 feet in the air must project at an ear-shattering concussive volume. Mounting these massive arrays onto the airframes introduced a cascade of complex engineering challenges. The UH-1 Huey, for all its rugged utility, relies on precise weight distribution and aerodynamic balance. Suddenly, maintenance crews were bolting blocks of heavy, non-aerodynamic metal directly onto the external skids or door mounts of the helicopters. This asymmetrical weight distribution fundamentally altered the flight characteristics of the aircraft. The speaker arrays acted like flat sails, creating immense drag on one side of the airframe, forcing the pilot to constantly compensate with the tail rotor pedals just to maintain a stable hover. Furthermore, projecting a 1,000-watt audio signal requires an immense amount of electrical current. A standard aviation alternator is designed to power internal avionics, navigation lights, and standard military radios. It is not designed to drive a stadium-grade amplifier continuously for hours at a time. The heavy analog amplifiers and their required battery banks had to be strapped down inside the passenger cabin. Aviation electricians had to jury-rig these high-draw systems into the aircraft's power grid, creating a constant, lingering risk of overheating the electrical bus or shorting out critical flight instruments in the middle of an operation. For the larger C-47 Skytrain, the aerodynamic drag was less of a critical threat, but the logistics were no less complex. The massive cargo aircraft could carry much larger speaker banks and could loiter over target zones for hours, circling like a high-altitude acoustic bomber. However, the fixed-wing aircraft lacked the ability to hover in place over tight valleys or specific grid coordinates, limiting its precision compared to the rotary wing platforms. With the hardware finally integrated and the aircraft modified, the tactical deployment of the operation began. The flight profile dictated by military planners was exceptionally demanding, both mechanically and psychologically. To maximize the dread and ensure the opposing forces were caught off guard, all acoustic missions were scheduled strictly under the cover of absolute darkness, typically operating between midnight and the early hours of the morning. Look closely at the mechanics of this flight profile because it reveals the immense risk placed on the flight crews. Aviators were instructed to pilot their overloaded UH-1 helicopters at treetop level, navigating purely by analog instruments and faint moonlight over jagged, unforgiving terrain. To give the audio enough time to saturate a specific grid coordinate, the pilots had to dial back their airspeed to a crawl, often hovering just above the stall speed of the aircraft or the safe operating limits of the rotor system. By flying low and slow in the dark, the aviators were deliberately stripping away their two greatest defensive assets, speed and altitude. They were trusting that the psychological weight of the audio broadcast would completely paralyze any opposing forces below before they could raise their weapons. When the air crews reached their designated target zones and hit the playback switch on the magnetic tape reel, the physical experience inside the cabin was overwhelming. Even with heavy aviation headsets and the relentless, deafening roar of the turboshaft engine, the sound of the wailing, distorted voices vibrated upward through the metal floorboards of the aircraft. The acoustic pressure was immense. The crew chiefs and door gunners, peering out into the pitch-black jungle below, were subjected to the same creeping psychological onslaught they were projecting downward. The endless, looping cycles of funeral gongs, synthetic wind, and weeping voices echoed off the surrounding hillsides, creating a surreal and deeply disorienting environment for the very men operating the machinery. Initially, the sheer audacity of the acoustic bombardment worked exactly as the intelligence officers back at the military headquarters had theorized. During the first few weeks of deployment, the tactical results filtering back to the command centers were striking. When these low-flying platforms swept over suspected enemy encampments and initiated the broadcast, the immediate result was absolute operational chaos on the ground. Forward air controllers and intelligence listening posts monitoring regional enemy radio traffic noted immediate localized spikes in panicked communications. The sheer decibel level of the 1,000-watt broadcast was so physically overwhelming that it actively disrupted local enemy communication networks. Opposing unit commanders were recorded frantically demanding to know the source of the noise, formations scattered into the brush. In some sectors, Allied infantry patrols, moving into areas subjected to the overnight broadcasts, reported finding abandoned equipment, suggesting that the sudden, terrifying wall of sound had successfully fractured the discipline of small, isolated units, prompting them to abandon their positions. The intelligence officers had seemingly achieved their objective. They had bypassed ideological conditioning and leveraged cultural folklore to clear contested zones without utilizing conventional artillery or high explosive ordnance. The defense contractors had engineered the perfect frequency of dread, and the aviation mechanics had successfully built the platforms to project it. But military operations exist in a dynamic, highly reactive environment. The architects of this operation had severely underestimated the combat discipline and the pragmatic adaptability of the North Vietnamese forces and the National Liberation Front. The fatal flaw in the operational architecture was not the psychological theory, nor was it the quality of the magnetic tape. The flaw was the physical, undeniable reality of the delivery system itself. When you strip away the anthropological theory and the psychological intent, what is an acoustic broadcast helicopter fundamentally doing? It is a heavy machine hovering in the night sky, moving very slowly and emitting a continuous, deafening, highly directional signal. For the air crews trapped inside the cabin, the immense volume of the outward-facing speakers created a massive tactical blind spot. The wailing voices completely masked the ambient sounds of the environment. A door gunner, leaning out of a UH-1, could not hear the distinct mechanical pop of small arms fire from the tree line. They could not hear the heavy, rhythmic thud of a heavy machine gun cycling in the darkness. The crew was effectively deafened to incoming fire until the rounds physically tore through the aluminum skin of the airframe. Down in the dense vegetation, the initial shock of the wailing spirits was beginning to wear off. The opposing infantry officers, battle-hardened and highly disciplined, quickly realized that the voices of their ancestors were remarkably localized. The weeping souls were not rising from the swamp. They were projecting from a very specific, mechanical source hovering 500 feet above the canopy. A profound shift was about to occur across the tactical theater. The United States military had spent millions of dollars and thousands of man-hours constructing an invisible weapon designed to paralyze the enemy with fear. But as the operation expanded, intelligence officers began receiving alarming situation reports from the aviation units. The psychological dread was rapidly dissolving into overwhelming, localized rage. And as the opposing forces looked up into the dark sky, they realized that the wailing tape recording provided a perfect, uninterrupted acoustic beacon, pointing exactly to where they needed to aim their anti-aircraft weaponry. As the calendar turned to 1969, the Joint United States Public Affairs Office authorized a massive expansion of the acoustic campaign. What began as a highly experimental initiative was rapidly institutionalized into the daily combat rhythm of the theater. Aviation units stationed from the Central Highlands down to the dense, saturated lowlands of the Mekong Delta were increasingly tasked with these specialized nighttime operations. The master reels of Ghost Tape Number 10 had been duplicated, distributed, and integrated into the logistical supply chain. Night after night, flight crews powered up the heavy turboshaft engines of their UH-1 Huey helicopters, lifted off the tarmac, and plunged into the absolute darkness of the jungle canopy. The initial situation reports filtering back to the intelligence command centers had been highly promising, filled with accounts of localized panic and fractured enemy discipline. But as the operation scaled upward throughout the following months, a severe operational contradiction began to emerge in the after-action reports. The psychological shock value of an unseen acoustic weapon inherently relies on the element of surprise. The first time an opposing infantryman hears a localized, wailing spirit echoing through the dark foliage, the cognitive dissonance is profound. But the human brain, especially a brain subjected to the intense, pragmatic rigors of continuous infantry combat, is highly adaptable. The opposing forces of the National Liberation Front and the North Vietnamese Regular Army were arguably among the most highly disciplined, ideologically conditioned, and tactically adaptable light infantry in the world. They were operating in their own terrain, under a rigid command structure that heavily prioritized unit cohesion over individual panic. Consider the sensory environment of the targeted soldiers on the ground as the months dragged on. The acoustic broadcasts were no longer a surreal, isolated anomaly. They were becoming a recognizable pattern. As the initial dread began to wear off, the basic mechanics of infantry training began to override the cultural superstitions the intelligence officers had tried so hard to weaponize. The North Vietnamese officers and unit commanders began to analyze the acoustic signature of the Weeping Souls. They realized something crucial about the nature of the broadcast. The voices of their ancestors were not rising organically from the damp earth or echoing from the surrounding tree lines. The sound was undeniably localized. It possessed a distinct, trackable point of origin, moving methodically across the night sky at a steady, predictable speed. By stripping away the anthropological theory, the opposing forces identified exactly what the American military was projecting. It was not a wandering soul. It was a 1,000-watt electrical amplifier bolted to a heavy piece of aviation machinery, hovering 500 feet in the air and broadcasting a continuous directional signal. This realization fundamentally altered the tactical dynamic of the entire operation. The United States military had engineered the audio to fracture morale, but instead, it began to generate overwhelming, localized rage. The opposing infantry did not drop their weapons and surrender to Allied patrols. Instead, they raised their rifles, tracked the deafening source of the sound, and began firing blindly into the night sky. This unexpected kinetic response placed the American flight crews in a position of extreme, unparalleled danger. Look at the physical geometry of this new tactical reality. The aviators piloting the UH-1 Huey helicopters were forced to fly low and slow to overcome the natural sound-dampening effects of the triple canopy jungle. They were navigating purely by analog instruments in faint moonlight, attempting to keep the heavy asymmetrical speaker arrays stable in the air. Inside the cabin, the crew chiefs and door gunners were completely deafened by their own outward-facing equipment. The immense acoustic pressure of the ghost tapes masked the distinct mechanical pop of small arms fire from the ground. The crew was essentially flying a highly magnetic, slow-moving target beacon. They were entirely blind to the incoming threat until heavy anti-aircraft fire physically impacted the aluminum skin of the airframe. The opposing forces quickly adapted to this vulnerability. North Vietnamese anti-aircraft crews began utilizing the ghost broadcasts as a perfect acoustic tracking mechanism. In the dense jungle, where visual target acquisition at night is nearly impossible, sound is everything. The heavy, wailing loop of the tape allowed anti-aircraft gunners to calculate the exact speed and trajectory of the low-flying helicopters. They set up overlapping fields of fire using heavy weaponry, primarily the deeply reliable 12.7mm heavy machine gun. Instead of scattering into the brush, concealed formations would wait patiently in the darkness. As the deafening sound of the broadcast passed directly overhead, they would open fire simultaneously. Streams of green tracer rounds would arc upward from the canopy, converging on the slow-moving acoustic platform. Infantrymen armed with rocket-propelled grenades would fire their unguided munitions into the sky, attempting to physically knock the broadcast helicopters out of the air. The situation reports, arriving at the Military Assistance Command Vietnam, rapidly changed in tone. Intelligence officers were no longer reading summaries of widespread enemy defections. Instead, they were processing endless damage assessments from the aviation units. The broadcast aircraft were returning to base heavily damaged, their structural frameworks riddled with heavy caliber impacts. In some instances, the operations resulted in total airframe loss and severe tactical outcomes for the crews involved. A profound institutional dilemma immediately settled over the planning rooms. The intelligence officers and the psychological operations architects were forced to reevaluate the entire architecture of the mission. The operation was fundamentally failing its primary, stated objective. The highly engineered laboratory frequencies were not consistently overcoming the ideological conditioning of the enemy. The ghosts were not terrifying the North Vietnamese forces into submission. However, they were doing something else entirely. The architects of the program stared at the tactical maps spread across their tables, noting the specific grid coordinates where the acoustic helicopters had taken heavy fire. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese regulars were absolute masters of camouflage and operational security. They constructed massive subterranean tunnel networks and utilized the heavy foliage so effectively that they were virtually invisible to standard American aerial reconnaissance. Standard observation helicopters could loiter over a sector for hours and see absolutely nothing. But the moment a flight crew broadcast ghost tape number 10 over that exact same sector, entire concealed battalions would suddenly expose themselves. Their anger and frustration at the psychological intrusion overrode their camouflage discipline. By firing heavy machine guns and rocket-propelled grenades at the acoustic helicopters, they were instantly revealing their exact fortified positions through bright muzzle flashes and heavy tracer fire. This realization triggered a massive controversial pivot in the strategic application of the tapes. If the broadcasts were failing as a psychological deterrent, but succeeding brilliantly at drawing deeply concealed enemy forces out of hiding, had the military accidentally invented the ultimate target generation system? To capitalize on this unintended consequence, tactical commanders began altering the flight profiles. They stopped sending the UH-1 broadcast platforms out alone. Instead, they began pairing the slow-moving acoustic helicopters with heavily armed kinetic assets. The ghost ship became the bait. Under this new doctrine, the broadcast helicopter would push forward into a contested valley, initiating the deafening loop of funeral gongs and weeping voices. Flying completely dark, several thousand feet above or trailing miles behind, was the Hammer. These were dedicated attack platforms, such as the AH-1 Cobra gunship, armed with heavy rockets and rotary cannons, or the massive AC-130 Spectre, carrying an overwhelming arsenal of aerial artillery. The moment the opposing forces on the ground lost their discipline and opened fire on the wailing ghost tape, the trap snapped shut. The heavy tracer rounds aimed at the low-flying broadcast helicopter provided perfect, illuminated grid coordinates for the attack aircraft circling above. The AH-1 Cobras would immediately dive on the anti-aircraft positions, saturating the tree line with high-explosive rockets before the enemy forces had any opportunity to relocate. This tactical adaptation completely inverted the original intent of the Joint United States Public Affairs Office. What began as an anthropological theory designed to peacefully neutralize the opposing infantry through cultural superstition had morphed into a highly aggressive kinetic baiting mechanism. The military was no longer trying to hack the human mind to prevent combat. They were deliberately antagonizing the enemy to force a conventional engagement on American terms. Yet, this strategic pivot generated intense friction between the psychological operations planners and the aviation commanders tasked with executing the missions. For the pilots and crew chiefs sitting inside the broadcast helicopters, the reclassification of the operation offered very little comfort, and they were now officially designated as live bait. They were ordered to fly heavy, sluggish, deafeningly loud aircraft at treetop level, actively hoping that an opposing heavy machine gun crew would try to shoot them out of the sky so the trailing gunships could engage. It was an incredibly high-risk proposition that placed immense strain on the air crews and the maintenance teams trying to keep the riddled airframes airworthy. The tactical blowback of sound had created a localized war of attrition, fought in the dead of night, where the primary weapon was not high explosives, but sheer synthesized auditory harassment. As 1970 approached, the mounting operational costs, the heavy damage to aviation assets, and the shifting political realities of the conflict began to cast a long shadow over the acoustic campaign. Intelligence officers and high-ranking commanders began to aggressively debate the actual value of the program. Evaluating the declassified aftermath of Operation Wandering Soul reveals an institution deeply divided on what exactly they had accomplished. Had the military genuinely tapped into a profound cultural fear and extracted localized tactical advantages, Or had they simply spent millions of dollars to invent the most dangerous, highly trackable target beacon in the history of modern warfare? When the calendar rolled into 1970 and 1971, the massive United States military bureaucracy demanded what it always demands from a protracted campaign: measurable metrics of success. The defense establishment operates on data. If an artillery battalion fires 1,000 high explosive shells into a grid coordinate, reconnaissance aircraft can photograph the craters, analysts can calculate the structural damage to enemy supply lines, and logisticians can perfectly balance the financial cost of the munitions against the tactical outcome. The return on investment is highly visible. But how does a military institution mathematically quantify the erosion of the human mind? When intelligence officers attempted to audit the aftermath of the Acoustic campaign, they immediately ran into a wall of institutional division. Evaluating the declassified debriefing documents reveals a command structure completely fractured over the true value of the broadcasts. The psychological operations planners who originally pitched the concept were desperate to claim a strategic victory. They flooded the command centers with localized situation reports pointing to specific clusters of enemy infantry who had surrendered to Allied patrols. During extensive interrogations, a notable percentage of these defectors, utilizing the military defection initiative known as the Q Ahoy program, explicitly cited the nighttime broadcasts. They admitted that the endless looping audio of wailing spirits had severely degraded their unit cohesion, preventing them from sleeping and fracturing their operational focus. For the intelligence analysts sitting at their desks, this was the ultimate validation. They had successfully weaponized a cultural vulnerability. But aviation commanders across the theater looked at the exact same data and came to a completely different, highly hostile conclusion. Put yourself in the position of a maintenance officer responsible for keeping a fleet of UH-1 Huey helicopters airworthy. These rotary wing platforms were the absolute logistical backbone of the entire conflict. They were needed for medical evacuation, troop transport, and critical supply runs. Instead, these multi-million-dollar airframes were being stripped down, loaded with heavy 1,000-watt electrical amplifiers, and sent out into the pitch-black night to act as slow-moving acoustic bait. The aviation leadership argued that the cost-to-benefit ratio was entirely absurd. To secure a handful of isolated defectors, the military was needlessly endangering highly trained air crews and artificially inflating the maintenance burden on the aviation network. When a UH-1 Huey took heavy 12.7mm machine gun fire during a broadcast mission, the damage was rarely superficial. Rounds tore through the aluminum skin, severing vital hydraulic lines, shattering transmission housings, and compromising the structural integrity of the tailboom. Even if the crew managed to nurse the heavily vibrating aircraft back to base, the airframe was often grounded for weeks, requiring hundreds of man-hours to repair. In instances where the aircraft suffered a fatal operational outcome and went down in the dense foliage, the military was forced to launch massive, highly dangerous recovery operations just to secure the crash site. The aviation commanders presented a brutally pragmatic argument to the Pentagon. They insisted that drawing concealed enemy forces out of hiding by infuriating them with a tape recorder was a wildly inefficient use of aviation fuel and human capital. Look closely at the correlation problem that haunted the intelligence reports. The defectors who surrendered often mentioned the ghostly audio, but were they genuinely terrified by the simulated spirits of their ancestors? Or were they simply exhausted and demoralized because every time the deafening audio played, it was immediately followed by an AH-1 Cobra gunship saturating their exact position with high explosive rockets? It became impossible for the analysts to untangle genuine cultural dread from the purely kinetic exhaustion of being relentlessly hunted by heavy aerial artillery. From a purely scientific and acoustic engineering standpoint, the post-operation analysis was crystal clear. The audio technicians had succeeded brilliantly. They had pushed analog magnetic tape technology to its absolute limit, mathematically optimizing specific frequencies to induce maximum cognitive dissonance. The signal-to-noise ratio, the application of extreme tape delay, and the artificial stretching of the funeral gongs were technically masterful achievements in the field of sound design. Yet, the systemic failure of the entire campaign lay entirely outside the laboratory. It was an ideological failure. The United States military establishment in the 1960s operated under an overwhelming technocratic hubris. There was a prevailing institutional belief that any problem on Earth, including the deepest spiritual traditions and cultural fears of a foreign population, could be systematically engineered, mass-produced on an assembly line, and neutralized with enough wattage and aviation fuel. The planners fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the opposing force. The National Liberation Front and the North Vietnamese Regular Army were not passive, superstitious civilians wandering aimlessly through the jungle. They were highly disciplined light infantry, fighting a generational anti-colonial conflict. They were subjected to intense ideological conditioning and possessed a pragmatic adaptability that the American planners entirely underestimated. The Pentagon assumed that a technologically generated ghost would trigger a total psychological collapse. Instead, the targeted soldiers listened to the broadcasts, identified the mechanical limitations of the delivery system, and adjusted their anti-aircraft sights accordingly. They applied lethal, calculated logic to a synthetic, supernatural threat. This profound mismatch between American technological capability and the psychological reality of the opposing infantry is why modern military academies continue to study this campaign. The operation serves as the ultimate historical baseline for the limits of acoustic manipulation. Today, psychological operations units stationed at installations like Fort Liberty still heavily analyze the mechanics of these historical broadcasts. The core doctrine has evolved significantly. Modern defense contractors no longer attempt to simulate ancient ghosts or broadcast theatrical, heavily layered soundscapes over hundreds of square kilometers. The focus has shifted from psychological manipulation to physical acoustic denial. Contemporary systems, such as the long-range acoustic device, utilize highly directional arrays to project concentrated narrow beams of sound. Instead of trying to hack human superstition, these modern systems are designed to cause physical auditory discomfort, acting as a non-kinetic barrier to disperse crowds or communicate over massive distances at sea. The military learned a very hard, very expensive lesson in the skies over Southeast Asia. Acoustic force is highly effective when used as a precise, localized tool. It is strategically disastrous when used as a broad, theatrical weapon meant to overwrite the fundamental willpower of a dedicated adversary. Historians and military analysts remain deeply divided on the ultimate legacy of the operation. Some argue that, despite its eventual tactical blowback, the campaign remains a fascinating and partially successful experiment. They point out that in the early months of the deployment, before the opposing forces adapted to the flight profiles, the broadcasts did exactly what they were designed to do. They generated widespread localized confusion, disrupted enemy communication networks, and proved that a military could project power into a tactical environment without dropping a single piece of high explosive ordnance. But a more critical analysis reveals a darker institutional truth. The ghost tapes represented the absolute height of an American technocratic machine desperately trying to engineer its way out of a conflict it did not fully comprehend. The military spent millions of dollars, utilized highly advanced recording studios, modified dozens of transport helicopters, and risked the lives of countless aviators, all to project a mathematical illusion into the dark canopy. The operation was a perfect reflection of the broader conflict. It was a masterpiece of industrial logistics and engineering capability, entirely disconnected from the human reality on the ground. As you review the declassified schematics of the speaker arrays and read the translated debriefings of the opposing infantry, a lingering question begins to surface. If a military establishment in the analog era was willing to synthesize a ghost using magnetic tape and raw electrical voltage to manipulate the human mind, what exactly are they building today? The hardware has transitioned from heavy analog amplifiers to advanced digital algorithms, artificial intelligence, and deepfake synthetic media. The platforms have moved from low-flying helicopters to hyper-connected digital networks. The technology has evolved beyond recognition, but the institutional desire to bypass conventional defenses and directly hack the psychology of the target remains exactly the same. And it forces us to wonder, what does ghost tape number 10 look like in the 21st century?